Welcome to the Your Love Ministries podcast with Pam Baggett and me, Brenda Porch. We are talking about Jonah. Now, if you missed the first part, you're probably going to want to go back and listen to that one because we're going to start the story about halfway through. We know that God told Jonah to go to Nineveh, but he decided he was going to run from God and hide from him. So he gets on a boat and it doesn't go too well. He ends up getting tossed in the ocean and swallowed by a fish. And I'd say Jonah had a rough couple of days, wouldn't you, Pam?
At least three, yes.
All right. So now we are going to continue with the story, and we're going to see if Pam will read for us Jonah chapter 3, because chapter 2 is pretty much nothing but a prayer. I mean, we read the first part of it, but this is Jonah crying out to God, saying he's sorry and help me.
Yeah, I think he was praying for 3 days doing that too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he had plenty of time to come up with a good prayer. And so we're going to move on to Jonah chapter 3. And Pam, if you'll read verses 1 through 5 for us.
Okay. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it the message that I tell you. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city. It was 3 days' journey in breadth. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's journey. And he called out, Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And the people of Nineveh believed God. They called for a fast and put on sackcloth, from the greatest of them to the least of them. Okay, now walking 3 days to get from one side of Nineveh to another tells us that this was a huge city. For it to be that big in those days, it must have been an incredible place in economy, military strength, or some other ways. The kind of place where the citizens would feel confident, maybe even arrogant. But these folks believed the message that Jonah brought from God. That's amazing to me.
You know, I think knowing what we know about Jonah, I'll bet he enjoyed that part.
Yeah.
Where he's getting to go around saying, where does it go? Yet 40 days, and yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. In other words, you guys got 40 days, and God's going to come in and take over, and bad things are going to happen to you in 40 days. And I bet he's all, excited. That part of it, he doesn't mind too much, is telling them something bad's going to happen. But then they all go into sackcloth and ashes. I mean, what you said about the city being important and these people being important, and they probably had some wealth involved in a city that large, for them to be willing to put on sackcloth. Now, I don't fully understand all that, but I know that they wore robes and such, and had clothes, kind of like we would have. But the sackcloth, to me, just sounds like they're wearing just a big old bag over their bodies.
Yeah, it would have been rough textured, and so it would have been a lack of comfort. And that was the main thing about grieving or showing this kind of humility, was to deny yourself comfort. That's why fasting was in it. That's why ashes were in it. There's not to be any comfort if you're showing your sincerity.
And so they put, let's see, and the people in didn't believe God, they called for a fast and put on sackcloth. So they're all going around very hungry and very uncomfortable because they believed Jonah. And so I guess he learned his lesson because he actually did what God told him to do. So, I'm actually impressed. He must have been very believable when he was telling the people what was going to happen. But, I just have to wonder if somebody came and started telling Americans that the Lord was about to rain down judgment on all of us, I'm not sure that from the greatest to the least, we would be willing to humble ourselves and inconvenience ourselves and survive some discomfort to show our love and our dedication to the Lord.
Doesn't seem likely.
No, kind of scares me sometimes too.
Yeah.
All right. So now we're going to keep going. Jonah chapter 3, verse 6 through 10. The word reached the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. That doesn't sound pleasant. And he issued a proclamation and published through Nineveh, by the decree of the king and his nobles. Let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Let them not feed or drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and let them call out mightily to God. Let everyone turn from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hand. Who knows? God may turn and relent and turn from his fierce anger, so that we may not perish. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, God relented of the disaster that he said he would do to them, and he did not do it. Now, let's go back over what we just read here. The king believed it so much that first he did it, and then he sent out a proclamation. But it wasn't just fasting from food, they were also fasting from water. And it wasn't just men, it was animals as well. This was serious business. These people were truly afraid. And, the king is not saying, and if we do all this, I know God will change his mind. He's saying, maybe we'll have a chance that God changes his mind, because he says, let everyone turn from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hand. So that king knew something about what was going on in that city. That king knew that they were doing things that were contrary to God's plan and God's word, because that's not a normal thing you would say to your people. You might say humble them. I'm just kind of guessing here, but you might say humble yourself, but he specifically points out violence. And I find that kind of interesting.
Well, it may be that they knew about God. They might have heard enough about his actions in other places. Those sailors might even have gotten the word to Nineveh. We don't know, but that could have been it. They were certainly going to be talking about it. So God may have set things up so that they were already hearing about what he could do. And they were afraid of having him focused on them. Maybe they were aware that their level of sin had gone too far. We don't know why they reacted as they did, but from their king to all the citizens, they all humbled themselves completely in hopes of escaping God's wrath.
It talks about man and beast. So I'm really hoping that that the children were spared, but we don't know that.
No, we don't.
Because a baby going without anything for several days, I don't know, maybe they did, and the baby still lived, but I just always think about the children.
I don't think, we also don't know how long it lasted before God said, oh, okay, you guys, you turned it around. I'm right. We don't know that they had to go a long time. They might have it. We don't know it. But we do know what Jonah did about it. We got to get into this. Jonah 4, verses 1-3. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. And he prayed to the Lord and said, oh, Lord, isn't this not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you were a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. I'm sorry. This man's mind is just wrong all over the place. Here's our boy Jonah and his wonderful attitude again. He wanted these folks to be destroyed. But look at his complaint about God. This is what he doesn't like about his God. I knew that you're a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. He knew that God was a good guy who wanted people to give him a chance to forgive them. And that's why he didn't want to come. That was his whole reason for trying to get away from God, because he didn't want God to be merciful.
Yeah, but if God hadn't been a merciful God, he would have drowned in that ocean. So he's complaining about the very thing that saved his own skin. And now he's mad because these people are being forgiven. And I find that, you just can't even really wrap your mind around it. And can't you just hear the disdain in I think you read it really well, in his voice as he's saying, well, I knew you were merciful and all of that. And that's why I didn't want to come in the first place. I knew you were going to forgive these people. You ought to be punishing them. You shouldn't be forgiving them. But that's not God. And it wasn't Jonah's place to say it. And if I'd been Jonah, I'd be thinking, oh, wait, I better be careful what I say because, there could be
Oh.
I could walk around in the belly of a lion or something for a few days. I could
But
actually be killed this time.
he asked for God to kill him. He was so upset with this. He wanted to die if God was going to be nice to people. Don't give me that kind of world. I mean, this guy is a cartoon. It just everything about him is. I would like to draw. If I could draw, I would draw cartoons of Jonah's story because his whole personality is a joke. In that he has everything so upside down backwards. Why would we want a God who wasn't merciful? Why
Well,
would we want it?
but God wasn't making his life that comfortable. I mean, look
No.
at verse 8. When the sun rose, he appointed a scorching east wind, and the
Oh,
sun beat
you're
down on
jumping
the
ahead of
head of Jonah.
yourself.
Oh, I am?
You
Oh,
are. You got to start
I,
back at verse 4.
I got to start back at verse 4. Thank you for saving me from telling something I shouldn't have said.
You don't tell the ending first. You got to tell the
Oh,
get there.
well, I do
Okay.
things backwards
It's
sometimes.
complicated. I know.
Jonah 4, 4 through 8. And the Lord said, do you do well to be angry? In other words, God's saying, do you have a right to be angry? Jonah
Mhm.
went out of the city and sat to the east of the city and made a booth for himself there. And a booth is kind of like a little shelter, right?
Yeah.
Like a
Basically.
covering.
Very
Um,
basic.
and now the Lord God appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah so that it might shade over his head to save him from his discomfort. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant. But when dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant so that it withered. And when the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint, and he asked that he might die. It is better for me to die than live. So God was not happy with Jonah. He leaves the city. He's pouting. He's mad that God forgave him. It really reminds me of children when there's a big brouhaha and you have to say, okay, you're in trouble and you're not. And the one that's in trouble goes, well, how come he's not in trouble? That's not fair. So, Jonah was so far off in his thinking because if God had been fair, he'd have killed Jonah. He would have let Jonah live. And so now that Jonah is out there, he is pouting because God let these people live. And so first God's nice to him, gives him a little shelter, but then he's not so nice to the point that Jonah is faint and he's now asking again to die. I just hope he'll get the hint and change his mind maybe this time. First it was a fish, now it's the wind and heat. Do you think he's going to catch on and do what he should do, Pam?
No. And in fact, look at what verse 7. Let's see which verse is. The reason he had built this little shade and chosen this spot that he was in was because he wanted to watch the destruction. He went out of the city and sat in the east of the city and made a booth for himself there. He sat under the shade so he could see what would become of the city. He still wants to see the show he paid for, he thinks. He wants to see them all die. So he's not getting it. And he's still all about himself. And I think that his middle name is Hypocrite because he is just such a classic one. He's got it all backwards, upside down, and inside out. It's craziness.
And, I wonder if when he went out of the city, he was really hoping now they're going to get it.
Yeah.
And I'm going to get to watch them. And I'm going to fix me up this little nice little comfortable place with shade. And I'm going to sit back and I'm going to watch God take his wrath on them. And then when God doesn't, he's wanting to die again.
Well, it sounds like he thought he had convinced God and go ahead and do what he thought he should do. And that's something humans all do too, is we tell God what we think would be best, and then we sit back and assume he's going to go with our plan. And
I do that sometimes.
We're about as foolish as he is. But
I'm
he
guilty.
disapproves of God. He wants an angry, vindictive God, not a loving, merciful one, at least as far as other people's concerned.
Yeah.
Of all the people I wouldn't expect God to use to do his will, this guy would be on the top of the no list. But here he is.
I guess that just shows you that there are some people that are hard-headed and
yeah.
they're not going to get it no matter how many times God gives it to them.
This is definitely the classic. Let's see what next. Verses 9 to 11. But God said to Jonah, but do you do well to be angry for the plant? And he said, yes, I do well to be angry enough to die. And the Lord said, you pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should not I pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 people or persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle? Okay, God's trying to reason with Jonah, but it's not working. Jonah is stuck in his attitude. He's not going to come out of it. I could almost see God beating his head against a wall, because it's just not going to do any more good than that, because Jonah's just not going to get the point.
This phrase that he uses, that they don't know their their right hand from their left, and also much cattle. When I look at that, I start thinking what he's saying to Jonah is they don't know everything that you do. They
That's
haven't
right.
had the training you have. They haven't, they don't get to talk to me the way you are. And yet
Exactly.
they came back to me just because you warned them that I was going to punish them. And yet Jonah is still not happy with it. He is still not. And, I just wonder if there are people out there right now who have decided that there are certain people that shouldn't go to heaven no matter what.
Oh, yeah.
Even if they repent. And, and I've known, and on a personal level, I can kind of understand why they might feel that way. If someone has really hurt you in some way, murdered your child, or, done something like that, it could be that you have those feelings against them, and you don't want them to be forgiven. But we're also taught that our forgiveness by God depends on our forgiving others. And so Jonah is just off base so many times. It's not even funny. I don't even.
Oh, it is funny. It really is. I'm sorry. I laugh all the way through this book. I'm sorry.
You laugh and I scratch my head and shake my head. I'm like, really? I don't get it. But when you're talking about being a big city, 120,000 people, that is a lot. And Jonah wanted them all to die. He wanted them all to be punished. I don't know.
That was a huge city in those days. I mean, can you imagine having the infrastructure even now for 120,000 people? And this was not now. This was back in a much more primitive time. And they had a city that was able to handle that population. That would have been very strange and impressive. But, I also think that Jonah's, you mentioned something about when he was preaching, that he had done a good job of preaching what was going to happen. He enjoyed that part of it. He was preaching and predicting destruction for these folks that he didn't like. So he was probably more enthusiastic and passionate in that preaching because he thought he was going to get to see it happen. And so it was there, but I don't see any reason to expect that Jonah is going to go through any kind of personality transformation. He is really committed to being a class A sourpuss.
Yes. And, I find it also strange that I think this is the last of the verses that we have. This is how the chapter ends. This is how the story ends, where God is still trying to reason with Jonah, and Jonah is still not getting it. And, we don't get to know what happens next. And as I was reading through this, I'm like, wait, what? This is the end? But, God, did you punish Jonah for his attitude? Did you throw him back and put him in another fish, or
straighten him out somewhere?
Or did you make him stay in Nineveh and become one of those people there and have to get along with them because that's where we're not told any of that.
Aw.
I know. Because the bottom line is he didn't get it. He didn't get it. He's probably not ever going to get it. And that's kind of sad.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move on to what can we learn? And I think you kind of alluded to this earlier. God uses people we would never pick to do his will. If I were picking someone to go out and to tell these people, I would never have picked Jonah. Never. His attitude alone was a deterrent. But God chose Jonah for a reason. And I kind of have to wonder if it was, hoping he was giving Jonah those extra chances. He was showing Jonah that mercy that Jonah accused him of having in a negative way, which really should have been a positive attribute. And, I have no doubt that the word of God moved these people, and hopefully they continue to serve God, and the Lord sent people to teach them and whatever. But when something like that happens to us and we realize that we've had a bad attitude about something, we need to get right with God. And because God's going to win every single time, God's will is going to be done. And it just makes me think about that old saying, okay, are we going to do this the hard way or the easy way? Because if Jonah had done it the easy way, then he would have been going to Nineveh, delivering the message, happy that it happened, and he wouldn't have had to sit in a stinky fish or be vomited up on the shore. Oh, okay. The next thing that I saw when I look at the story is it's not our job to decide who hears the gospel and who does not. And I think that is critical for us to understand. Every human being has a soul, and God loves every single one of them. And it is not our prerogative to say, well, I don't want to teach this person because, or I don't want to work in this area of the city because, or I don't want to work in this area of the country because. We are just told to spread the word. And it's wonderful when somebody listens and they obey the gospel. But if they're not, that's okay, because that's between them and God. We're just told to teach and to go, but we don't get to pick. We have to teach everybody that we come in contact with. I've heard you talk about different people that have come across your life here lately in the last year or so, that you've gone through some unusual circumstances. And I just love it that you talk about how whatever happens, you use it as an opportunity to tell someone about the Lord. And that's one of the things I really admire about you.
Well, I'm going to say something about someone else that way. My sister-in-law, Rachel, she and my brother were missionaries, and she died a few years ago. But when she knew that she was dealing with a terminal illness, the first thing she did was make a list of people she wasn't sure she'd gotten the message across to yet. And she contacted everyone she could. She talked to strangers anywhere she was. She talked to people helping her get through an airport, anything she could do. She talked to them about God. She told them about Jesus' love. She was not going to miss a chance. That was her focus of those last months. She wasn't going to miss a chance to share the love of God with everybody. And I admired her for that. She was my example on that.
That's a beautiful story. And we're all terminal. We're all going to die. And I am so sorry for your loss. She sounds like a wonderful, wonderful woman.
Oh, it was a blessing to know her. Yeah.
Yeah. And we know that she's going to be in heaven, but that should be our goal too, is to anybody that we come in contact with, to tell them about Jesus and about Jesus's love. All right. And then the last thing is forgiveness is a key to living a life that is pleasing to God. Now, we've already said over and over again that Jonah was angry because God was forgiving the people of this city. We must forgive others. In fact, Luke chapter 6, verse 37 through 38 says, judge not and you will be not judged. Condemn not and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Give and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. However we treat others is how that measure is going to be used to treat us. So if Jonah did not want the Ninevites to be forgiven, then God is saying, fine, but that means you don't want me to forgive you either. And we need to remember that. It doesn't mean that we have to trust them. Forgiveness and trust are two different things. Forgiveness is given, trust is earned. And there are going to be people in our lives that hurt us and do wrong by us. And we may need to separate ourselves from them, but we can forgive them. And I think that's critically important. And it pains me that Jonah did not understand that, because that is probably one of the most beautiful parts to me about being a Christian, is that we can forgive one another. It's not easy, it's not fast, but it can be done with God, because all things are possible with God. All right. Did you have anything else you wanted to add, my friend?
Well, one of the things about Jonah and forgiveness is that he was unwilling to forgive people who had not sinned against him. It wasn't his position to forgive them. They hadn't done anything to him.
It's true.
And yet he wanted them not to have forgiveness from God. He was that ugly a personality and ugly a heart that he had wanted the worst for people that hadn't done anything wrong to him. And we do that, though. We do think, we judge someone and point at them and think, God needs to get you because you're not doing right. And that's the old thing of the speck in the log.
Yes.
Because we're trying to get rid of something in someone else rather than dealing with us first. And Jonah had a lot of work he should have been doing on himself.
Yes. And I just pray that although we don't have the end of the story, that God was able to prick his heart and that he sent someone to him, because if not, then Jonah's story is not going to end very happily.
No.
So, all right. Well, as Pam likes to say, we looked at a comedy story in the Bible and what Jonah did and what he didn't do and what he should have done. But I think the big takeaway for me is whenever we look at these Bible stories, we need to see what we can apply back to ourselves, because they're not just for our entertainment. It's not just a nice story to tell children in Sunday school, although it's a great story. We need to find a reason to apply it to ourselves. And that's why we're given the Bible. It's not just a storybook or a comedy. It's for our benefit, for our instruction. So we thank you for joining us. We hope you learned something. And I pray that there's no one out there that has that black heart like Jonah. But if there is, I know God will deal with them. So thank you for joining us. We hope you'll come back. Again, this has been Brenda Porch and Pam Baggett.
You almost forgot, didn't you?
I did. I almost forget. Like, now who is that lady I'm talking to? And we hope you'll come back and join us next time for another edition of Your Love Ministries. Tell Me a Bible Story.